There is a certain kind of darkness that people fear more than anything else. Not the darkness of a storm, not the darkness of a back alley at midnight, not even the darkness at the bottom of a grave. No, the kind of darkness people truly fear is a kind they cannot explain, the kind that walks into a room wearing a smile, shakes your hand warmly, asks about your children, and then, before you even realize what has happened, has already decided whether you live or die. That is the darkness of organized crime at its most refined. That is the darkness of the American Mafia at its peak. And tonight, we are going deep into that world, deeper than most people are ever willing to go. Because tonight, we are not talking about a boss who ruled with brute force alone. We are not talking about a man who climbed to the top of the most powerful crime family in the history of the United States by being the loudest, the most violent, or the most feared in the traditional sense. Tonight, we are talking about a man who ruled in near silence. A man who conducted the business of the underworld from the shadows of the shadows. A man who, by the time most people even knew his name, had already been running billions of dollars worth of criminal enterprise for years. Quietly, carefully, invisibly. His name was Carmine Tramunti. And what makes his story unlike almost any other in the annals of American organized crime is this. The man was legally blind. Think about that for a moment. In a world defined by surveillance, by watching, by the constant need to read a room, to read a face, to see who was standing at the door before they walked through it. In that world, a man with failing eyesight rose to become the boss of the Lucchese crime family, one of the 5 families of the New York Mafia. He saw the underworld not with his eyes, but with something far more dangerous. He saw it with instinct. He saw it with patience. He saw it with a mind so sharp, so calculating, so perfectly tuned to the frequencies of power and survival, that the physical limitation of his vision became almost irrelevant. Almost. This is the story of a man who was overlooked precisely because he did not look like what he was. This is the story of a man who built an empire not with guns blazing, but with whispers and ledgers and loyalty forged over decades. This is the story of Carmine Tramunti, the blind boss who ran the streets. Stay with us, because what you are about to hear is not just a crime story. It is a story about power, about patience, about what happens when ambition outgrows a man's body, but never outgrows his mind. And it is a story that ends, as so many of these stories do, not in triumph, but in the cold, indifferent hands of justice and time. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment down below and let us know, where in the world are you watching this right now, and what time is it where you are? We got viewers tuning in from New York to Karachi, from London to Lagos, from Rome to Rio, and we love knowing that this community stretches across every corner of the globe. Tell us your city, your country, the hour on your clock. And if you are new here, welcome to the channel. Hit that subscribe button right now. Because every single week, we bring you stories from the darkest, most dangerous corridors of history. Stories that most people never hear told quite like this. Now, let us begin. To understand Carmine Tramunti, you have to first understand the world he was born into. Because no man becomes what Carmine became in a vacuum. No man wakes up one morning and decides to dedicate his life to the underworld without having been shaped, sometimes brutally, sometimes quietly, by the environment that surrounded him from the very first breath he ever drew. Carmine Tramunti was born in 1910. The world in 1910 was a world still finding its footing after the Industrial Revolution had rearranged everything. Cities were swelling. Immigration was flooding the eastern seaboard of the United States, and New York City, in particular, was becoming something that no city in the history of the world had ever quite been before. It was becoming a pressure cooker, a place where the dreams of millions of people from every corner of the earth were compressed into a few square miles of tenement buildings, pushcart markets, and streets that never, ever slept. Italian immigrants have been pouring into New York since the late 1800s, and by the time Carmine was born, communities like East Harlem and the Lower East Side had become something close to a parallel Italy planet in the middle of the American Northeast. These were tight communities, insular communities, communities where the language of the old country still filled the air on summer evenings, where the church and the family were the twin pillars around which all of life revolved, and where, if you needed something done, if you needed protection or justice, or just a loan to get to the winter, you did not call the police. You did not trust the government. You went to the men in the neighborhood who had power. You went to the men who had organized themselves into something far older and far more complex than anything the American legal system could easily categorize. You went to the mafia. By the time Carmine Tramunti was old enough to understand what was happening around him, the Italian-American organized crime world was already in the process of being formalized. The old Mustache Petes, the first generation of Sicilian mob bosses who had brought their traditions directly from the island, were beginning to give way to a newer, more American generation of criminals, men who had grown up on these streets, who spoke English, who understood American law and American business and American ambition. The Castellammarese War of 1930 and 1931 would reshape the entire landscape of organized crime in New York, and out of that conflict would emerge the five families, the Maranzano model that divided New York into organized criminal territories and established a commission, the governing body that would regulate the underworld for decades to come. Into this world walked Carmine Tramunti, and from the beginning, he was paying attention in ways that other young men his age were not. He grew up in East Harlem, a neighborhood known by many names, but known most intimately by the people who lived there simply as a neighborhood. East Harlem in those years was a dense, electric place, full of life and color and noise, and also full of quiet danger. It was a neighborhood where you learned early that the way you carried yourself mattered more than almost anything else, where you learned that silence could be a weapon, where you learned that the man who talked the least was often the man who knew the most. These were lessons that Carmine absorbed not from books or from school, but from the streets themselves, from watching, from listening, from understanding the rhythms and the rules of a world that operated entirely outside the law. Now, here's where the story of Carmine Tramunti begins to diverge from almost every other story in the canon of American organized crime. Because the young men who rose through the ranks of the mafia in those years were, for the most part, physical men, men who proved themselves with their fists first, with their guns second, and with their minds, if at all, a distant third. Violence was the currency of advancement, the ability to hurt people, to intimidate people, to make people afraid. That was how you climbed. That was how you demonstrated value to the men above you. That was how you got noticed. But Carmine had a problem. Or, depending on how you look at it, Carmine had an advantage disguised as a problem. His eyes were failing him. The exact nature of his vision impairment has been described in various ways over the years. Some sources describe him as partially blind. Others suggest his condition was more severe. But the essential truth is clear. Carmine Tramunti could not see the world the way other men could. He could not walk into a room and read every face at a glance. He could not spot a tail from 50 feet away. He could not do the things that required the sharp, immediate processing of visual information that so much of the street life of that era demanded. So he developed other things instead. He developed his ear. He developed his memory. He developed his ability to read a situation through sound and tone and the specific weight of silence in a conversation. He developed patience, not the restless, impatient patience of a young man waiting to act, but the deep geological patience of a man who has learned that time is the one resource that, if managed correctly, will eventually solve most problems. He developed relationships. He learned to make people feel safe around him, comfortable around him, because he could not rely on physical intimidation to create distance or command respect. Instead, he had to earn respect through something more durable, through reliability, through consistency, through the demonstrated ability to handle things correctly. These were not skills that the average street criminal valued highly, but they were skills that the men who ran things, the men at the very top of the criminal hierarchy, recognized immediately, because those men had seen enough flash and fury and reckless violence to know that none of it lasted. What lasted was discipline. What lasted was a man who could keep his mouth shut. What lasted was a man who thought 3 steps ahead and never panicked. Carmine found his way into the orbit of the Lucchese crime family, then known under various names as the organization evolved over the decades, and he did so not by making a dramatic entrance, but by simply being indispensable. He made himself useful. He understood numbers. He understood the mechanics of how money moved through criminal enterprises, through loan sharking, through gambling, to the kind of financial infrastructure that turned street-level criminality into something resembling a business. And he was discreet, relentlessly, almost pathologically discreet. in a world where men talked too much and died too young because of it. Carmine Tramunti was a man who seemed to understand that every word spoken was a potential liability. The Lucchese family, in those years, was being shaped by one of the most important figures in New York organized crime history, Gaetano Lucchese, known to everyone simply as Tommy Three Finger, named for the missing digits on his right hand. Tommy Lucchese was himself a man who understood the value of operating below the radar. He cultivated political connections. He avoided unnecessary violence. He built relationships with law enforcement through corruption rather than confrontation, and he ran his family with a subtlety that stood in sharp contrast to some of the more explosive personalities in the organized crime world of that era. Tommy Lucchese was, in many ways, the perfect boss for Carmine Tramunti to learn from, because Lucchese embodied the principle that the most dangerous man in the room is the one you never quite figure out. Carmine watched. He learned. He built his own base of operations in East Harlem, extending his reach through the gambling networks that were the lifeblood of neighborhood-level organized crime in New York during those decades. Numbers running. The illegal lottery that was woven into the fabric of working-class New York life was Carmine's territory. He ran it with precision. He ran it with loyalty. He paid people correctly. He resolved disputes quietly, and he never gave anyone a reason to bring attention to his operation. In an era when federal law enforcement was beginning to wake up to the scope and sophistication of Italian-American organized crime, when the Kefauver Committee hearings of the early 1950s had briefly pulled the curtain back for a stunned American public, Carmine Tramunti was a kind of figure who did not appear in the newspapers. He did not appear on the radar of ambitious prosecutors. He appeared, to anyone looking from the outside, to be simply a man from a neighborhood who knew a lot of people. That invisibility was not accidental. It was a product of years of careful, intentional construction. Carmine understood something that many of his contemporaries never learned, that in the long game, the most valuable thing a man in his position could possess was not power that everyone could see, but power that no one knew existed until it was already too late to do anything about it. He was building something slow and quiet and enormously durable, and he was building in the one city in America where the stakes of that game were the highest they had ever been anywhere in the world. By the time the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, Carmine Tramunti had been in the life for 3 decades. He had survived things that killed other men. He had navigated shifts in leadership, internal power struggles, the constant pressure of law enforcement, the ever-present danger of rivals within and outside his own family. He had done all of this with his compromised vision and his extraordinary mind, and he had emerged not merely intact, but stronger, more embedded, more trusted, more powerful than almost anyone outside the innermost circles of the Lucchese family would have suspected. The streets of East Harlem had made him, but Carmine Tramunti was about to show those streets and the entire criminal world of New York exactly what they had made. He was about to step into the light, and in doing so, he was about to disappear even further from view, because that was his genius. That was always his genius. The moment everyone finally started looking at you, that was precisely the moment you became impossible to see. There is a particular kind of man in the world of organized crime who never appears to be climbing. He does not elbow his way forward. He does not make speeches or declarations. He does not surround himself with an entourage designed to signal his importance. He simply appears. One day you look around, and he is already there, already inside the room that you thought was closed, already sitting at the table that you thought had no empty seats. He has been moving this whole time, steadily, quietly, without a single dramatic gesture, and by the time you realize how far he has come, he is already somewhere else entirely. That man was Carmine Tramunti. The 1950s and into the 1960s were years of enormous internal evolution for the Lucchese crime family and for the New York mob in general. The old guard was aging. Tommy Lucchese himself, for all his brilliance, was a man who had come up in a different era, the era of Prohibition, of the foundational wars, of the violent consolidation of power that had shaped the mafia into the institution it had become. By the late 1950s, Tommy was still at the helm, but the world around him was changing in ways that no single man, however gifted, could entirely control. Law enforcement was evolving. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, had long been dismissive of the organized crime problem in America, Hoover famously preferred to focus on communists and bank robbers and kept the Bureau away from the mob for reasons that have been debated by historians ever since, with explanations ranging from strategic caution to outright compromise. But the Appalachian meeting of 1957 changed everything. When law enforcement stumbled upon a gathering of more than 100 top organized crime figures at a farmhouse in upstate New York, a meeting called to address the aftermath of the assassination of mob boss Albert Anastasia and the transition of power in the Genovese family, it became impossible for anyone to maintain the fiction that the American Mafia did not exist as a structured national organization. The newspapers went wild. Congress convened hearings. And the FBI, under enormous public pressure, was finally forced to take organized crime seriously in a way it never had before. This shift in law enforcement attention created a new kind of danger for men like Carmine Tramunti. The old ways of operating, the assumption that as long as you kept violence off the front pages and kept your political connections warm, you could operate without serious federal interference, were no longer sufficient. The heat was rising. The scrutiny was intensifying, and in that environment, the men who were most likely to survive were the ones who had always operated with the kind of discretion that the new reality demanded. Men like Carmine, his reputation within the Lucchese family during this period was that of a man who could be absolutely trusted. That word, trust, is used so casually in everyday life that it barely registers anymore, but in the context of organized crime, trust is the single most valuable and the single most rare commodity in existence, because the environment of the underworld is one in which the incentive to betray is always present. Law enforcement offers deals. Rivals offer money. Fear offers its own terrible temptations. In a world where every man around you has a potential to become your enemy, the man who you can trust completely, who you know will never talk, will never break, will never put his own survival ahead of his loyalty, that man is worth more than any amount of muscle or money. Carmine Tramunti was that man. His record of discretion over 3 decades of life was essentially flawless. He had not given prosecutors anything they could use. He had not allowed his operations to become sloppy in ways that attracted attention. He had not surrounded himself with people who were careless or reckless. He chose his associates the way a master craftsman chooses his tools, with great care, with a clear understanding of what each one was for, and with an absolute intolerance for anything that did not meet his standard. His base in East Harlem remained the center of his power. The numbers operation he had built, there was an institution deeply woven into the social fabric of the neighborhood, generating money with the quiet regularity of a well-maintained machine. But Carmine was not just a numbers man. He was expanding. The 1960s brought new opportunities and new territories, and Carmine moved into them with the same careful patience that had characterized his entire career. He was involved in loan sharking, the underground lending that charged rates that made the most aggressive legal lenders look charitable by comparison, and that served a population of people who had no access to conventional credit and often no choice but to accept terms that were designed to keep them in debt forever. He was involved in the management of illegal gambling beyond just numbers. Card games, sports betting, the whole infrastructure of underground wagering that was, in those years, the single largest revenue stream in American organized crime. He was involved in labor, in the relationships between the mob and the unions that controlled the docks, the construction industry, the garment district, the restaurants, the whole vast machinery of New York City's working economy that the mafia had been quietly infiltrating and controlling for decades. And through all of this, Carmine maintained the most important relationship in professional life, his relationship with the men at the very top of the Lucchese family. When Tommy Lucchese died in 1967, it marked the end of an era. Tommy had been one of the great bosses, measured, politically connected, a man who had run his family for nearly 2 decades with consistency and a sophistication that had made the Luccheses one of the most powerful and most stable of 5 families. His death created a vacuum, and in the world of organized crime, vacuums are dangerous things. They attract men with ambition and insufficient patience. They create instability. They open doors for conflict. The transition in leadership that followed Tommy's death was, for the Lucchese family, a complicated and at times turbulent period. Carmine Tramunti was not the immediate successor. The family went through a period of governance by committee in some respects, with different figures holding various degrees of influence during the years following Tommy's passing. But Carmine was present throughout. He was at the table. He was advising. He was a steady hand in a room that was searching for steadiness. And in that role, he demonstrated something that pure ambition alone can never demonstrate. He showed that he was not just capable of building power, but capable of holding together when everything around was threatening to come apart. The men who watched him during this period saw something that impressed them enormously. Here was a man who could have pressed his own case aggressively. Here was a man who, if he had chosen to, could have positioned himself as the obvious choice of the kind of political maneuvering and alliance building that typically decided succession in organized crime families. But Carmine did not do that. Or rather, he did it so subtly, so gradually, so organically, that it did not look like positioning at all. It looked like service. It looked like loyalty. It looked like a man who was simply there, doing what needed to be done, not because he wanted something in return, but because this was his family and this was his responsibility. It was, of course, all three things simultaneously. Carmine Tramunti was loyal, yes. He was committed to the family, yes. And he was also, with every day that passed, becoming more and more inevitable. By the late 1960s, his position in the hierarchy of the Lucchese family was recognized by everyone who mattered. He was a street boss, the man who ran the day-to-day operations, who managed the relationships between the various crews, who resolved disputes and allocated territories, and ensured that the money flowed correctly and the books balanced, and nobody did anything stupid enough to bring the kind of heat that could threaten the whole enterprise. He was, in every practical sense, running the family. The title would come later. The reality had been established years before anyone made it official, and all of this accumulated power and responsibility and influence was held in the hands of a man who could barely see the faces of the people he was meeting with, a man who navigated the most dangerous professional environment in America primarily by feel, by instinct, by decades of accumulated knowledge about how human beings behave when they think no one is watching them closely enough. The cruel irony of Carmine Tramunti's visual impairment is that it may have given him the most important skill a boss can possess, the ability to see past appearances entirely. When you cannot rely on what a face looks like, you learn to pay attention to what a voice sounds like, what words a man chooses, what he doesn't say, how long the pause is before he answers a direct question, whether his laugh comes a half second too late. These are the tells that most people miss, because most people are looking at the face, looking at the body language, looking at all the visual information that fills the foreground and obscures the subtler signals underneath. Carmine heard those signals, and in 30 years of listening, he had never heard anything he couldn't eventually figure out. The ladder he had been climbing all his life was not the kind that anyone could see. It had no rungs that you could point to. It had no visible architecture. It was built entirely out of trust and time and the quiet, patient accumulation of obligations and loyalties and the slow, tidal movement of power from men who hold it carelessly to men who hold it with both hands and never, ever let it show on their face. Carmine Tramunti had been climbing that ladder his entire adult life, and now he was standing at the top of it. All that remained was the moment when the world would finally learn his name. That moment was coming, and when it arrived, it would change everything for him, for his family, and for the federal government that had been searching for years for the men it could not find. There are moments in history that are not announced with fanfare. There are moments that arrive not with the clash of cymbals or the roar of a crowd, but with a quiet decision made in a quiet room by quiet men who have spent their entire lives perfecting the art of making important things look unremarkable. The moment Carmine Tramunti became the official boss of the Lucchese crime family was one of those moments. It happened around 1969, and in the world of organized crime, where succession is never formally documented, where there are no press releases, no public announcements, no ceremony that the outside world is permitted to witness, the confirmation of Carmine's leadership reached the streets the way all such confirmations reach the streets, through word of mouth, through the behavior of the men around him, through the subtle, unmistakable shift in the way people spoke to him, deferred to him, consulted him, through the fact that when decisions needed to be made, the decisions that flowed from one man's judgment, and that man was Carmine Tramunti. The Lucchese family in 1969 was a formidable organization. It was, by most assessments, one of the wealthiest and most effectively run of 5 families. Its operations spread across multiple boroughs in New York City, across New Jersey, into New England, with tentacles in various industries and institutions that gave an economic reach far beyond what the average person would associate with organized crime. This was not just about illegal gambling and loan sharking, though those remained the financial engine. This was about labor. This was about construction. This was about the movement of goods through ports and airports and distribution networks that touched enormous swaths of legitimate commerce. The Lucchese family had embedded itself in the legal economy in ways that made it almost structurally impossible to simply cut out. The corruption was systemic. The relationships were layered. The money moved through channels that, from the outside, looked entirely unremarkable. And now Carmine Tramunti sat at the center of all of it. His daily life as boss was almost deliberately unimpressive to look at. He did not live in a mansion. He did not ride in armored cars. He did not surround himself with visible bodyguards or conduct his business in ways designed to signal his power. He remained what he had always been, a man from a neighborhood, a figure who existed within the community of East Harlem as a familiar, almost benign presence. He was known as a man who was fair, a man who could settle arguments, a man who had been around long enough that people trusted his judgment not because they feared him, but because he had earned that trust over decades of demonstrated reliability. This was, of course, enormously useful from a law enforcement perspective, because the FBI by 1969 was running aggressive operations against organized crime families in New York. The combination of the Appalachian fallout, the Kefauver hearings, the ongoing pressure from Robert Kennedy's Justice Department, and the growing sophistication of federal investigative techniques meant that the mob bosses of that era were operating under a level of scrutiny that their predecessors had never faced. The Gambino family, the Genovese family, the Bonanno family, all of them had experienced the disruptive impact of federal attention in various ways. Bosses had gone to prison. Operations had been disrupted. Internal structures had been stress-tested in ways that exposed weaknesses. The Luccheses, under Carmine, were different, not because they were immune to law enforcement attention. They were not, but because Carmine had spent his entire career building an organization that was structurally resistant to the kind of penetration that the FBI was attempting. The insulation between Carmine himself and the street-level operations of the family was extensive. The layers of management between the boss and the activities that generated criminal liability were multiple. The discipline around communication, about who talked to whom, about what was discussed in what context, was real and rigorously enforced. Carmine was intensely aware of surveillance. His visual impairment had, perhaps paradoxically, made him acutely sensitive to being watched, or rather, to the possibility that conversations might be monitored, that meetings might be observed, that the technological tools available to federal investigators were becoming more sophisticated with every passing year. He conducted his business in ways designed to minimize exposure. He spoke carefully. He met carefully. He was the kind of boss who could communicate enormous amounts of information in very few words, and who expected the men around him to be equally efficient, not out of impatience, but out of a deep understanding that every unnecessary word was a potential thread that investigators could pull. As boss, Carmine's primary responsibilities were what they had always been for a mob boss at that level: maintaining internal order, managing relationships with other families on the commission, ensuring that the money flowed correctly and that the men who generated that money were kept satisfied and controlled, adjudicating the disputes that inevitably arose in any organization where the stakes were high and the personalities were often volatile, and navigating the constant, ever-evolving threat from law enforcement without losing either his freedom or his grip on the family's operations. He did all of this with consistency that impressed even the men who had known him for decades. There is something about watching a man perform at the absolute peak of his ability in a role he was born to fill that inspires a particular kind of admiration. Not exactly awe, because the admiration is too specific and too grounded for something as abstract as awe, but something close to it. The men around Carmine saw a man who was completely in his element, who seemed never rattled, never unsure, never reactive in ways that suggested emotion was overriding calculation. He was the eye of the storm, the place where things were perfectly still, while everything around him continued to move with the dangerous, unpredictable energy of the criminal world at full speed. His management of the family's financial operations during this period was particularly notable. The early 1970s brought new economic pressures and new opportunities simultaneously. The heroin trade, which had been a significant source of revenue for various crime families in earlier decades, was increasingly complicated by federal attention and by the political sensitivity around drug trafficking in a way that it had not been before. The Lucchese family's relationship with the narcotics trade during Carmine's tenure has been a subject of historical debate. The official position of the commission, going back to the Appalachian meeting, was that families should stay out of the drug business, though in practice the line between official policy and actual behavior was consistently blurred. What is clear is that Carmine managed the family's exposure to this issue with great care, understanding that drug trafficking charges carried a different magnitude of legal consequence than traditional revenue streams of gambling and loan sharking. Meanwhile, the construction industry in New York was becoming an increasingly significant arena for organized crime activity. The building boom of the late 1960s and early 1970s created enormous opportunities for the families with labor connections to extract money from the contracts, the materials, the workforce, and the entire economic machinery of construction in ways that were enormously profitable and relatively well insulated from the most aggressive forms of law enforcement attention. The Luccheses had strong footholds in this world, and under Carmine, those footholds were cultivated carefully. But the aspect of Carmine Tramunti's reign as boss that historians and crime reporters have consistently returned to, the element that makes him truly fascinating as a figure, is not the financial architecture of his operation. It is the personal element. It is the question of what it meant to sit on the throne of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America when your eyes could not see the room around you clearly. How did that shape his leadership? How did he compensate? How did he ensure that the men around him could not take advantage of that vulnerability? The answer, as far as it can be reconstructed from the historical record, is that Carmine made his limitation irrelevant by building a structure around himself that did not require him to physically see everything. He was not a boss who needed to be at the scene. He was not a boss who needed to walk the streets and be visibly present as a show of strength. He ruled through his captains, through his underboss, through the chain of command that he had spent decades helping construct and that he had populated, insofar as he had any influence over the matter, with men who shared his values of discretion and reliability. And there was something else, something that the men who dealt with Carmine during his years as boss consistently mentioned when they describe him later, either in federal testimony or in the accounts that have filtered through from that world. There was a sense, when you were in a room with Carmine Tramunti, that he could see you more clearly than you could see him. That despite everything, despite the failing eyes and the apparent disadvantage, the man on the other side of the table had a complete and perfect picture of exactly who you were, what you wanted, what you were afraid of, and what he was going to do about it. That sense, that uncanny, slightly unnerving sense that you were being read by someone whose reading was more accurate than your presentation, was Carmine's greatest tool as a boss. It kept men honest. It kept men careful. It created around him an atmosphere in which it simply did not seem wise to try to deceive him, even though the rational analysis of the situation suggested that his visual impairment ought to make deception easier. It did not make deception easier. If anything, it made it harder, because the man with nothing to look at develops other ways of seeing. And Carmine had been developing those other ways of seeing for 60 years. The throne was his. The question now was how long he could hold it. Every empire has its season. Every man who rises in the underworld, who climbs the invisible ladder, who builds the empire of silence, who sits at the table where the most consequential decisions are made, every one of those men eventually faces the same truth. The truth that the net, no matter how patient you are, no matter how careful, no matter how many layers of insulation you build between yourself and the things that can bring you down, the net is always out there, and it closes. For Carmine Tramunti, the closing of a net was not a single dramatic moment. It was a process. It was a gradual, accelerating compression of the space around him, driven by forces that he had been aware of his entire career, but that, by the early 1970s, had achieved a sophistication and a focus that even his decades of experience had not fully prepared him for. The federal government's war on organized crime in the early 1970s was reaching a new level of intensity and effectiveness. The passage of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, in 1970 had given federal prosecutors a tool that was, in the context of organized crime prosecution, essentially revolutionary. Before RICO, the challenge of prosecuting organized crime was that the law was designed to address individual criminal acts committed by individual defendants. The mob, by contrast, was a system. It was an enterprise. The men at the top of that enterprise rarely, if ever, committed the specific criminal acts that generated liability. They directed, they authorized, they profited, but they were insulated from the street-level criminality by layers of people and structure. Prosecuting the man at the top for crimes he did not personally commit was, under the traditional legal framework, enormously difficult. RICO changed that. Under RICO, the existence of a criminal enterprise, a pattern of racketeering activity conducted through an organized group, could make every member of that enterprise criminally liable for the enterprise's activities, regardless of which specific act any individual member personally committed. This meant that the boss who sat his chair in East Harlem and gave quiet instructions could be held responsible for crimes committed by his soldiers on the other side of the city. The insulation that organized crime had relied on for decades was, in theory, penetrable for the first time. In practice, RICO cases were complex to build and complex to prosecute. They require extensive evidence of the enterprise's existence and structure of the pattern of criminal activity, and of the defendant's role in directing or participating in that enterprise. Building that evidence took time, took resources, and took the kind of sustained investigative commitment that the FBI was, by the early 1970s, increasingly willing to provide when it came to the leadership of the New York families. Carmine Tramunti's name was on the radar. It had been there for some time. Law enforcement had a reasonable understanding of his position within the Lucchese family by this point. Even if the evidence to support a serious prosecution remained elusive, his discipline had served him well for a very long time. But the net was tightening. The case that would ultimately bring Carmine Tramunti into federal court was not, in the end, built on RICO. It was built on something more traditional, on drug trafficking charges that connected him through the webs of association and financial flow that investigators have been patiently tracing to a heroin operation. The specific details of the case against Carmine involved his connections to a narcotics network that had been operating in and around New York, and the federal government's ability to demonstrate that Carmine, despite his carefully maintained distance from day-to-day street operations, had financial involvement in, and therefore criminal liability for the trafficking activity. The indictment, when it came, landed with the weight that such things always land with, not as a surprise, exactly, because in the world Carmine inhabited, the possibility of federal charges was never far from anyone's mind, but with a particular kind of weight that comes from the realization that the moment you've been preparing for and dreading for decades has finally arrived. It had arrived in all the preparation, all the careful construction of insulation and distance and deniability, would now be tested in the most public and unforgiving arena imaginable, a federal courtroom. Carmine Tramunti was in his early 60s by this time. He had spent more than 4 decades in life. He had survived things that destroyed other men. He had outlasted bosses and underbosses and captains and rivals and enemies. He had built something that was, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary achievement in the context of the world he had chosen. And now he sat at the defense table, an aging man with failing eyes, facing the full force of the federal government's determination to dismantle what he had built. The trial was, in itself, a demonstration of everything that made Carmine Tramunti who he was. He did not break. He did not cooperate. He did not reach for the exit that federal prosecutors always leave open for defendants who are willing to trade information for leniency. The code that had governed his life. The code that said you did not talk, you did not betray, you did not save yourself at the cost of the people around you. That code held even here, even in the worst circumstances of his life, even with his freedom and the remainder of his years at stake. He was convicted. The federal case against him succeeded, and in 1974, Carmine Tramunti was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He was in his mid-60s. 15 years, for a man his age and his physical condition, carried implications that went beyond a mathematical calculation of time served. It was, in many respects, a life sentence wearing a specific number. The reaction within the Lucchese family to Carmine's conviction and imprisonment was a reaction that always follows the fall of a boss, a period of transition, of internal recalibration, of the slow, complicated process of determining what comes next. The family did not collapse. Criminal organizations of that complexity and that depth rarely collapse simply because their leaders were moved. The structures are too embedded, the operations too ingrained in the economic fabric of the city, the replacement mechanisms too well established. But the particular quality of Carmine's leadership, that specific combination of patience and discretion, and the almost supernatural ability to read people that had defined his approach, that could not simply be appointed into someone else. What Carmine Tramunti had built could continue. What Carmine Tramunti himself was, that was irreplaceable. Inside federal prison, Carmine continued to be what he had always been. He did not become a cooperator. He did not provide information. He served his time with the same dignified, almost impenetrable silence that had characterized his entire career. The federal government, which had worked so hard to put him in a cell, found him no more communicative on the inside than he had been on the outside. He was, to the end, a man who kept his own counsel. He would not survive to see freedom again. Carmine Tramunti died in 1978 in federal custody from heart failure. He was 68 years old. He had led the Lucchese family through one of the most consequential and turbulent periods in the history of organized crime in America. He had done so with a pair of failing eyes and a mind that, until the very end, never failed at all. The streets that made him had long since changed beyond recognition. East Harlem of 1978 was not the East Harlem of 1910. Was not the teeming, vital, dangerous, alive neighborhood that had shaped the boy who would become the boss. The world had moved on in the ways that worlds always move on, indifferent to men who had given so much to navigate it. But somewhere in the fabric of New York City, in the institutions and the networks and the patterns of power that had been laid down during the years of his leadership, the imprint of Carmine Tramunti remained. Invisible as always, durable as always, the blind boss had seen everything, and he had taken most of what he knew with him into the silence. There is a word in the Italian language, in the specific dialect of the Sicilian tradition that gave birth to the American Mafia, that carries more weight than almost any other word in the criminal lexicon. It is a word that is not merely a rule or a regulation or a policy. It is a way of life. It is a philosophy. It is the invisible architecture upon which the entire structure of organized crime is built, and without which that structure would collapse in a matter of days. The word is omerta, and it means, in its simplest translation, silence. But that translation does not begin to capture what the word actually means in practice. Because in the world of the Mafia, silence is not merely the absence of speech. Silence is loyalty. Silence is identity. Silence is a price of membership and the proof of belonging and, in the most extreme circumstances, the choice between your freedom and your honor, a choice that, if you are truly of that world, is no choice at all. Carmine Tramunti lived omerta more completely than almost any figure in the recorded history of American organized crime. This is not hyperbole. When you examine the record of his decades in the life, when you look at what the federal government was able to build a case against him with, when you understand how long he operated at the highest levels of one of five families without generating the kind of evidentiary trail that eventually brings most men in his position down, you begin to understand that his commitment to silence was not just a personality trait or a professional habit. It was a central organizing principle of his existence. It was a thing that held everything else together. But the story of Carmine Tramunti and the code of silence is bigger than just Carmine himself, because the world he lived in, the world he helped to sustain and to lead, was a world built entirely on the premise that silence was not only possible but expected from everyone, at every level, in every circumstance, no matter what pressure was applied, or what inducement was offered, or what threat was made. And understanding that world, understanding the culture that produced and enforced that silence, is essential to understanding why Carmine was who he was, and how he was able to do what he did for as long as he did it. The code of silence in the American Mafia did not originate in America. It came across the ocean with the immigrants who brought the mafia from Sicily, and it was embedded in the institution with a depth and a seriousness that the transplanted American context only partially modified. In Sicily, omerta was not just a criminal code. It was a social code. It existed in a context where the state was historically absent or hostile, or simply irrelevant to the daily life of ordinary people, and where the only justice available was a justice that communities dispensed themselves through the informal institutions of the village and the clan. In that context, going outside authorities with your problems was not just futile, it was a form of social treason. It marked you as a person who had stepped outside the community, who had chosen the alien world of the state over the organic world of the people around you, and that marking was permanent and its consequences were severe. This tradition, transplanted into the streets of East Harlem and Brooklyn and the Lower East Side, was modified by the American context in significant ways. The American mafia operated in a society with functioning legal institutions, with free press, with law enforcement agencies of considerable sophistication and resources. The code of silence in this context served an explicitly practical criminal purpose. It was a primary mechanism by which organized crime families maintained operational security in the face of law enforcement pressure. But it was also something more than purely practical. It was also, for the men who truly believed in it, an ethical commitment, a statement about what kind of man you were, a demonstration that you understood and accepted the terms of the world you had entered. For Carmine, the code was never something that required enforcement in his own conduct. It was simply the way things were. From the earliest days of his involvement in life, there is no record of him ever providing information to law enforcement, ever cooperating with investigators, ever allowing himself to be put in a position where the boundaries of what he was willing to say were tested. He was a man who had decided, at some fundamental level, that the world of the streets operated by its own rules, and that the laws and the courts and the prosecutors existed in a separate universe from the one he inhabited, a universe that could occasionally intersect with his catastrophically, but that had no legitimate claim on his loyalty or his testimony. This was the philosophical position of omerta at its most complete, and Carmine Tramunti held it without apparent strain or conflict for the entirety of his adult life. But the code of silence in the 1960s and 1970s was under unprecedented pressure from forces that no amount of personal commitment could entirely contain. Because the federal government, in its evolving effort to break down the organizational structures of the American mafia, had discovered something that the mob's founders had perhaps never fully anticipated, that the code could be broken, that under sufficient pressure, with sufficiently attractive inducements, men who had sworn themselves to silence could be persuaded to talk, and that when they talked, the information they provided was of a quality and a specificity that no amount of external investigation could replicate, because it came from inside the machine itself. The beginning of the era of the mob informant, the era of men who made the choice that Carmine would never make, is traceable to figures like Joseph Valachi, whose testimony before the Senate in 1963 represented the first time a made member of the American Mafia had publicly and formally broken the code. Valachi's testimony, broadcast on national television to a riveted American public, pulled back the curtain on the structure, the rituals, the terminology, and the operational methods of organized crime in a way that was simultaneously enormously damaging to the mob's mystique and enormously useful to law enforcement's understanding of what it was dealing with. The commission, the 5 families, the initiation ceremonies, the hierarchy of boss, underboss, capo, soldier, associate, all of it laid out in plain English for a Senate committee and a television audience of millions. The impact of Valachi's testimony on the world that Carmine Tramunti inhabited was profound. It accelerated the government's investigative focus on the organizational structures of the families. It validated the framework that law enforcement had been developing for understanding how the mob was organized, and it demonstrated, for the first time in the most public possible way, that the code could be broken, that the wall of silence, however strong, was not impenetrable. For Carmine, watching these developments unfold from his position within the Lucchese family, the lesson was not panic. The lesson was refinement. If the code could be broken from inside, then the answer was to be more careful about who you brought inside, to be more rigorous about the vetting of the men around you, to be more deliberate about what information you share with whom, so that the damage any single informant could do was limited by the structural decisions you made before the crisis arrived. Compartmentalization, keeping people informed only about what they needed to know to perform their specific function, was not a new idea in organizational management, but it was an idea that Carmine applied to criminal organization with rigor and a consistency that reflected both his natural temperament and his clear-eyed understanding of the threat. He was also acutely aware, during his years as boss, of the evolving technological tools that law enforcement was bringing to bear on organized crime. Electronic surveillance, wiretaps, bugs, the interception of conversations that the participants believed to be private, was becoming an increasingly central element of federal organized crime investigations. The FBI's ability to plant listening devices in locations where mob figures conducted business had generated some of the most damaging evidence ever presented in organized crime cases, and the law enforcement community was investing heavily in expanding this capability. For Carmine, this meant that the very act of speaking, anywhere, in any context, about anything connected to his business, carried a risk that had not existed in the same way in earlier decades. The walls had ears in a way that was not metaphorical but literal, and the ears were federal agents working shifts around the clock. His response to this reality was to become even more economical in his use of words, not to stop communicating. Because communication is the lifeblood of any organization, criminal or otherwise, but to develop a vocabulary of reference and implication, and understood context that conveyed what needed to be conveyed without using a specific language that would translate into criminal liability on a surveillance recording. Men who knew each other well enough could communicate volumes in sentences that, to an outside listener, would be nearly meaningless. The mob had always operated with this kind of coded language to some degree. The traditional terminology of the life was itself a kind of encryption, but Carmine brought to it a particular intensity and a particular deliberateness that reflected the very specific threat environment of his era. This culture of silence that he maintained and embodied extended outward to the family in ways both direct and indirect. Men who worked under Carmine understood that discretion was not optional, that the culture of the organization they belonged to demanded a certain way of operating, a certain economy with information, a certain distance between the personal and professional, a certain understanding that the family's business was the family's business, and that nothing about it went beyond the walls of the family. This was enforced, when necessary, with a full range of tools available to organize crime. But the more effective enforcement, under Carmine's leadership, was cultural rather than coercive. The men who thrived in his organization were the men who shared his values. The men who did not share those values found, over time, that they did not thrive. The selection pressure of his leadership rewarded discretion and punished carelessness in ways that shaped the composition of the organization around him. And yet the wall was cracking. Not in Carmine himself, never in Carmine himself, but in the world around him. In the larger landscape of organized crime in New York in the early 1970s, the architecture of silence that the mob had maintained for decades was beginning to develop fractures that would, in time, become chasms. Men were talking. Not many. Not yet enough to bring the whole edifice down, but enough to demonstrate that the trend was moving in one direction only. The government was learning how to apply pressure with sufficient precision and sufficient intensity to make the calculation of silence versus cooperation shift for men who did not have Carmine's absolute commitment to the code. By the time Carmine went to prison in the mid-1970s, the era of the mob informant was still in its early stages. The truly catastrophic wave of cooperation, the wave that would, in the late 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, generate the testimony that brought down boss after boss and restructured the American Mafia beyond recognition. That wave was still building. Carmine did not live to see it break, but he felt it coming in his bones, the way a man who has spent his whole life reading the signals that other people miss can feel a change in the weather before anyone else can see the clouds. He went to his death without having contributed a single word to that wave. In a world that was slowly learning to talk, Carmine Tramunti remained, to the absolute end, silent. There is a kind of integrity in that, a terrible, costly, morally complex kind of integrity, because the silence that Carmine maintained was the silence of a man who chose loyalty to a criminal organization over any other claim on his conscience, but integrity nonetheless. a commitment to a code that he had accepted completely and honored completely, without equivocation or compromise or the quiet renegotiation that most human beings make with their principles when the stakes become sufficiently high. The code of silence was not just Carmine's professional practice. It was his identity. It was the thing he was, right down to bone. And it is perhaps the reason that even now, decades after his death, decades after the world he built has been transformed by the very wave of cooperation he saw coming, the name Carmine Tramunti is spoken in certain circles with a particular kind of respect. Not the respect you give to the most violent or the most powerful or the most feared. The respect you give to the man who was, above all things, the most real. Ghosts are not always the dead who refuse to leave. Sometimes, and this is especially true in the world of organized crime, in the world of institutions built from silence and loyalty and the long, patient accumulation of power, ghosts are the living, the men who have passed through an organization and been removed from it, either by death or by imprisonment, but whose influence remains behind like a scent in a room long after the person who wore it is gone. The decisions they made continue to shape the decisions of the men who follow them. The structures they built continue to hold the weight of operations conducted by people who never met them. The values they enforce continue to define the culture of an organization years and decades after those values were first installed. Carmine Tramunti was that kind of ghost. He died in 1978 in federal custody, and his death was not marked by the kind of public mourning or public drama that the deaths of more flamboyant, organized crime figures sometimes generate. There were no newspaper headlines of the sort that greeted the passing of men who conducted their lives more visibly. He went quietly, the way he had lived, without fanfare, without spectacle, without the need to announce himself even in the act of leaving. But the imprint he left on the Lucchese crime family and on the broader landscape of New York organized crime was real and lasting and worth tracing carefully, because it tells us something important about what legacy actually means in this world. The Lucchese family that Carmine left behind was, in the immediate aftermath of his imprisonment and death, navigating the same turbulence that affected all the 5 families in the mid to late 1970s. The federal government's campaign against organized crime was intensifying. The RICO statute was beginning to be deployed with increasing confidence and increasing effectiveness. The culture of silence, while still dominant, was showing the first serious cracks. And the leadership transitions that followed the removal of an established boss always create a period of internal uncertainty that the organization had to navigate without exposing too much vulnerability to either law enforcement or rival families. The men who led the Lucchese family in the years after Carmine, the figures who carried the organization to the turbulent later decades of the 20th century, inherited a structure that Carmine had helped to build and that reflected his priorities. The emphasis on discretion, the preference for financial sophistication over violent spectacle, the management culture that prized reliability and silence above flash and aggression. These were Lucchese family values that predated Carmine, rooted in the tradition that Tommy Lucchese himself had established, but that Carmine had maintained and in some ways deepened during his tenure. They represented a certain approach to the business of organized crime that was, in its own dark way, a school of thought, a philosophy of criminal enterprise that stood in contrast to more volatile approaches visible in other families during the same era. Whether that tradition could be maintained in the decades after Carmine's death is a complicated historical question. The Lucchese family, like all the 5 families, underwent enormous stress in the 1980s and 1990s as the RICO prosecutions of that era brought down entire leadership structures, and as a wave of cooperation that Carmine had seen come in his final years finally broke with devastating force. The family survived, but in a form that would have been barely recognizable to men who had built in the earlier decades, diminished in power, destabilized by the losses of key figures to prosecution and imprisonment, and operating in a landscape that had been permanently altered by the federal government's sustained campaign to dismantle what the 5 families had built. But the ghost of Carmine Tramunti remained relevant to that story not just as an institutional memory, but as a symbol, because as the era of the mob informant arrived and grew and eventually reshaped everything, as men who had taken the same oath that Carmine had taken, who had entered the same world under the same code, chose to break that code and cooperate with the government, the contrast of men like Carmine became starker and more meaningful. The defectors of the 1980s and 1990s were not cowards in any simple sense. They were men making rational calculations under almost unbearable pressure, and the government's ability to construct those pressure situations reflected genuine investigative sophistication. But the contrast between their choices and Carmine's choice, made under pressure that was, if anything, more complete and more decisive given his age and his physical condition, was a contrast that mattered to men who still believed in the code, however much the world around them was changing. In the oral tradition of the street, in the stories that circulate in the world of organized crime, passed from generation to generation through the channels that have always carried such things, through word of mouth and through a particular kind of institutional memory that closed communities maintain, Carmine Tramunti occupies a specific place. He is the example of what the code looks like when it is truly lived, not just professed. He is the man who, when the moment of truth arrived, was exactly who he had always claimed to be. In a world that is full of men who talk about loyalty and silence and honor, who use those words as freely and as cheaply as any other currency, Carmine was a man whose actions made the words real. This is his legacy in the most human sense. Not the numbers, not the territories controlled, or the money generated, or the organizational chart of a criminal empire. Those things are interesting historically, but they are not the core of what Carmine left behind. What he left behind was a demonstration, a proof of concept, a demonstration that the values of the world he inhabited could be held with absolute consistency by a human being operating under real-world conditions of extraordinary difficulty, held not perfectly in the comfortable theoretical space, where principles are easy to maintain, but perfectly in the actual world where everything is at stake, and the cost is real, and the temptation to find a more comfortable path is always present. His legacy is also visible in how he has been remembered by the broader culture of organized crime history. Carmine Tramunti does not have the name recognition of figures like Carlo Gambino or Vito Genovese, or even Tommy Lucchese himself. He does not appear in the popular mythology of the mafia with anything like the prominence of the bosses, who conducted their reigns in more public fashion. Part of this is simply the nature of his approach. A man who spent his entire life avoiding attention will, almost by definition, generate less of the dramatic narrative material that popular history feeds on. But part of it is also something else. Part of it is the specific quality of the obscurity he achieved. He is not forgotten in the way that unimportant people are forgotten. He is forgotten, or rather, overlooked, in the way that truly dangerous people sometimes are. The ones who understood that the greatest safety lay in not being fully seen. There is, in this, an almost philosophical irony. The man who mastered the art of invisibility has become, to history, somewhat invisible. The man whose greatest skill was making his power impossible to precisely locate has left behind a legacy that is similarly difficult to pin down. Real, substantial, clearly influential, but diffuse in a way that all truly systemic influence is diffuse. You cannot point to it in one place. You can only sense it distributed across the institutions and the culture and the patterns of behavior that he helped to shape. Among the researchers and historians who have studied the Lucchese family in depth, Carmine is regarded as one of its most significant figures, not the most dramatic, but perhaps the most complete. The boss who combined in a single person the financial sophistication, the organizational discipline, the personal integrity as defined by the code, and the leadership consistency that together constitutes something approaching an ideal of what a mob boss was supposed to be by the standards of the world he inhabited. He was what the institution aspired to produce, in an era when that institution was at or near its peak of power and complexity. That the institution has since declined, that the families of the 1970s are shadows of themselves today, diminished by prosecution, and internal decay, and the erosion of the cultural foundations that once made them coherent communities with genuine bonds of loyalty and shared identity, makes Carmine's story something more than just a crime story. It makes it, in a strange way, a kind of elegy. An elegy for a world that was, whatever its crimes and its violence and its exploitation of ordinary people, a world with its own internal logic and its own codes and its own values, however perverse those values appear from the outside. A world that produced at its peak a figure like Carmine Tramunti, a man of genuine intelligence and genuine commitment, operating in the service of genuine evil, but doing so with consistency and a completeness that commands a particular kind of attention, even as it demands a particular kind of judgment. The ghost of Carmine Tramunti walks through the history of organized crime in New York, not loudly, not dramatically, not in the way that the ghosts of more theatrical figures walk. He walks quietly. He walks in the spaces between the recorded events, in the gaps where the evidence runs thin. And the only thing you can say for certain is that something was happening and that someone was managing it with extraordinary care. He walks in the tradition of discretion that the Lucchese family cultivated across its history. He walks in every story about a boss who held the line, who kept the code, who chose silence when everything around him was beginning to speak. He is the standard against which the men who came after were inevitably measured. And in a world that increasingly failed to meet that standard, the ghost of the blind boss from East Harlem stands as both an inspiration and an accusation, a reminder of what the code was supposed to mean, and a rebuke to every man who found it too heavy to carry when the weight became real. Every story in the underworld ends the same way. Not necessarily with a bullet, though that is common enough. Not necessarily with handcuffs in a courtroom, and a sentence read aloud by a federal judge, though that too is claimed its share. Every story in the underworld ends with time, with the simple, absolute, completely democratic force of time, which does not negotiate and does not defer and does not care about what you built or who you are or how carefully you planned. Time is the one adversary that no man in any world, criminal or otherwise, has ever defeated. And the story of Carmine Tramunti, for all the extraordinary things it contains, is ultimately a story about a man who met time on time's terms. He died in 1978. He was 68 years old. He died in federal custody, in the kind of institutional setting that is about as far from the streets of East Harlem as it is possible to get, those streets that had made him, that had given him everything, that he had given so much of himself to in return. He died without having broken his code, without having provided the government that held him with a single word that it could use against the world he had spent his life building. He died as he had lived, contained within himself, true to the commitments he had made in some earlier decade when he had looked at the world around him and decided what kind of man he was going to be. That death and the manner of it is a final chapter of a story that deserves to be understood in full. Not sanitized, not romanticized, but understood. Because to understand Carmine Tramunti completely, you have to be willing to hold two things in your mind simultaneously. You have to be willing to acknowledge the genuine impressiveness of what he was, the intelligence, the discipline, the extraordinary consistency of character across an entire lifetime, while also being absolutely clear-eyed about what that character was in service of, about what the organization he led actually did to the people around it, about the cost that his world extracted from the communities and the individuals who had the misfortune to intersect with it. Because the story of the American Mafia is not only a story about interesting men with interesting lives, it is also a story about the loan shark's customer who paid and could never get out from under the interest. It is a story of the numbers runner's family living in poverty while the profits floated upward to men in quiet rooms. It is a story of the labor union whose members were robbed of their pension funds by the criminal hands that had wrapped themselves around the institution that was supposed to protect those members. It is a story of the neighborhoods that were used as platforms for criminal enterprise and left behind, sometimes literally physically destroyed, when the enterprise moved on or when law enforcement finally caught up with the men who ran it. East Harlem, the neighborhood that made Carmine Tramunti, is itself a study in the complicated relationship between organized crime and community. The mob in East Harlem was not, from the community's perspective, simply an alien force imposed from outside. It was woven into the fabric of neighborhood life in ways that were sometimes beneficial and sometimes devastating, and usually both simultaneously. The numbers game that Carmine ran provided employment, in a sense, to the runners and the collectors and the people who managed its daily operations. It provided a form of entertainment and the dream of a payout to people whose legitimate financial options were severely limited. It was, in that sense, embedded in the economic and social life of the neighborhood in ways that made it genuinely hard to simply characterize as exploitation, even though exploitation was absolutely what it was. But the loan sharking was not ambiguous. The violence that was always present as the ultimate enforcement mechanism, even when it was not being used, was not ambiguous. The corruption of public institutions, The politicians, the police, the judges, the labor officials who were bought and maintained and used as tools of criminal enterprise, was not ambiguous. These were harms, real harms, harms that fell on real people who had not chosen to live inside the world of organized crime, but who found themselves affected by it regardless of their choices, because the world of organized crime had decided to make their community its theater of operations. Carmine Tramunti was not personally responsible for every harm that the Lucchese family's operations generated during his years of leadership, in the way that a man who commits a violent act is responsible for that act. But he was responsible in the deeper and more diffuse sense of having been the man who led the enterprise, who made the strategic decisions that determined what the enterprise did and how it did it and where it directed its energies. The responsibility of leadership extends to the consequences of the institution being led. And on that accounting, Carmine Tramunti carries a weight that his personal qualities of discipline and loyalty and silence do not diminish. This is the reckoning that his story demands. Not a simple moral judgment, not the reduction of a complex human being to a cartoon villain, but the honest acknowledgement that the qualities we might find impressive in him were in service of something that caused genuine damage to genuine people. That intelligence and patience and integrity, applied in the service of a criminal enterprise, do not become virtuous. They become more dangerous. They extend the enterprise's reach and its durability and its capacity to harm. The better Carmine was at what he did, the worse it was for the people on the other side of the ledger. And yet the story compels us. It compels us because human beings are complex, and the qualities that make a person effective in the world, that make them interesting, memorable, worth studying, are not cleanly separable from the ends those qualities serve. We are drawn to the story of the blind boss not because we endorse his choices, but because we recognize in him something that speaks to something in us, the desire to be completely true to what you are, the desire to build something lasting, the desire to be seen, truly seen, in the fullness of who you are by the world around you. These desires are not criminal desires. They are human desires, and Carmine Tramunti pursued them with a completeness that is rare in any human life, criminal or otherwise. His story is also, in the final analysis, a story about limitations, about the things that even extraordinary qualities of mind and character cannot ultimately overcome. The federal government that brought him down was, in its own way, a mirror of him, patient, institutional, building its case over years rather than months, learning from its mistakes, getting better at its craft the way Carmine had gotten better at his. The clash between the man and the institution that finally caught him was, in that sense, a clash between two forms of the same long-game patience. And the outcome was not determined by who was smarter or more committed, but by which side had more resources to sustain the game. The government had more resources. It always has more resources, in the long run. That is not a comforting conclusion for anyone who believes in the romantic mythology of the outlaw who beats the system, but it is the truth. The system always wins, eventually. The net always closes, eventually. The question that Carmine Tramunti's story raises is not whether it closes. It is what kind of man you were when it did, whether you held to what you believed in when the cost of holding became everything. Whether the person who went into the darkness of federal prison was recognizably the same person who had walked the streets of East Harlem 70 years earlier, sustained by the same code, the same values, the same identity. For Carmine Tramunti, the answer was yes. He was, from beginning to end, exactly who he was, completely, consistently, without deviation or apology or the small, quiet surrenders that most of us make to circumstance over the course of a lifetime. He was a man who chose his world entirely and inhabited it entirely and paid the full price of that choice without complaint and without betrayal. That is not a morally admirable story. The world he chose was a wrong world, and the price he paid was also paid by people who never had his choice. But it is a complete story, a story about a human being who was, in every sense of the word, whole. He left no recorded last words. He left no memoirs, no interviews, no public statements of any kind that might give us a window into what he thought or felt or believed in the privacy of his own mind. He left the world the way he had lived in it, in silence. And that silence, which was for so long the source of his power, became in the end the shape of his absence. A silence that fitted perfectly the contours of the man who had spent his whole life filling it. The streets of New York have produced many extraordinary figures in the long, complicated, violent, occasionally brilliant history of organized crime in America. Men whose stories capture something essential about ambition and loyalty and the seductive darkness of the underworld. Men whose lives illuminate, in ways that conventional history sometimes cannot, the underside of the American story. The parts that happen in the shadows, in the rooms that the cameras never reached, in the world that existed parallel to the one that appeared in the newspapers and the textbooks. Among all those figures, Carmine Tramunti stands in a particular place. Not the most famous, not the most powerful by raw measure, not the one whose name triggers immediate recognition in the way that a handful of the very biggest names do, but perhaps the most complete, the one whose story, when you trace it from beginning to end, forms the most coherent arc, the one who was most fully, most consistently, most authentically himself across the entirety of life lived in one of the most demanding and unforgiving environments in human history. The blind boss who ran the streets, the man who saw everything without seeing, the man who built an empire of silence and kept faith with that empire even when the empire could no longer protect him, the man who went into the dark, carrying the code and never came back out. That is Carmine Tramunti. And now you know his story. The shadows of history are full of men like Carmine Tramunti, men whose names were never meant to be spoken loudly, whose power was always most real when it was invisible, whose stories have been waiting in the margins of the historical record for someone to come along and tell them the way they deserve to be told. That is what we do here. Every single week, we go into those shadows and we bring back the stories that most people never hear. We tell them the way a story like this deserves to be told, with honesty, with depth, with the full weight of what these lives actually meant. If this story moved you, if you found yourself leaning forward somewhere in the middle of it, caught by the gravity of a world you cannot quite look away from, then you are exactly who this channel is made for. Hit that like button right now. Drop a comment and tell us what you thought of the blind boss. Was he a man to be admired in some complicated way? Or was he simply a criminal who got exactly what he deserved? We want to know what you think. And subscribe, because what we're coming for you next is going to take you even deeper into stories that are even darker, even more complex, even more human in all the ways that human beings can be extraordinary and terrible simultaneously. The streets are full of stories. We're just getting started.